Welcome back. I want to open with something that sounds almost counterintuitive the first time you hear it, but that is one of the most thoroughly supported findings in the behavioral economics and psychology of money. The people who own the most and spend the most are, on average, less financially secure than the people who own and spend significantly less. Not because they earn less, often they earn more, but because the act of accumulating things and optimizing for maximum consumption actively undermines the conditions required to build and keep wealth. This is the paradox at the heart of today's episode. We live in a culture that continuously sells us the idea that more is better. More income, more things, more experiences, more status signals. And yet the research on wealth accumulation, happiness, and financial security consistently points in a different direction. The people who are genuinely financially free have almost universally arrived there not by maximizing their consumption, but by simplifying it. Today, we're going to look at this through the lens of minimalism, not as an aesthetic lifestyle trend or a decluttering philosophy, but as a set of concrete financial rules that, applied systematically, tend to produce a specific outcome. You always have money. Not because you earn an extraordinary amount, but because you've set up your financial life in a way that keeps more of what you earn, directs it towards things that actually matter, and eliminates the invisible drains that consume the wealth of people who are trying much harder than you. Research published in the Journal of Consumer Research by Burroughs and Rindfleisch found that materialism, the tendency to place high value on the acquisition of material possessions as a path to happiness, was negatively correlated with both financial well-being and psychological well-being. High materialism individuals reported higher levels of financial stress, more impulse spending, lower savings rates, and paradoxically lower life satisfaction despite higher consumption levels. The researchers found this relationship held across income levels, suggesting that the consumption orientation itself, not a lack of money to consume, was the primary driver of both financial strain and reduced happiness. That's a significant finding. Let's build on it. Before we get into the specific rules, I want to be very clear about what minimalist finance is and what it isn't. Because the word minimalism triggers different reactions in different people, and I don't want anyone to tune out based on a misunderstanding. Minimalist finance is not about deprivation. It is not about living in a bare apartment with nothing on the walls and eating rice and beans every night. It is not a competition to see who can own the fewest possessions or spend the least money. If that were the definition, it would be both joyless and financially beside the point. What minimalist finance actually is, at its core, is intentionality. It is the practice of being deliberate about where your money goes, keeping the spending that genuinely contributes to your quality of life, eliminating the spending that doesn't, and directing the gap between income and intentional spending toward the things that build lasting financial security. It is, in the most practical sense, the art of getting maximum life from minimum expenditure. It is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who hankers after more. Seneca, a Roman philosopher and Stoic. The Stoic philosophers who were writing about this 2,000 years ago understood something that modern behavioral economics is now confirming with data, that the default human tendency to want more, to constantly habituate to whatever we have and then reach for the next level, is not a path to satisfaction. It is a treadmill, and minimalist finance is, at its core, a systematic way of stepping off that treadmill and redirecting the energy and resources it was consuming towards something that actually compounds in value over time. The concept behavioral economists call hedonic adaptation, formally documented by psychologists Shane Frederick and George Lowenstein, describes exactly this treadmill dynamic. Their research found that individuals adapt to most material improvements in their circumstances within weeks to months, returning to their baseline emotional state regardless of the upgrade. A new car produces elevated satisfaction for roughly 3 to 6 weeks before or becoming the new normal. A larger home produces elevated satisfaction for roughly 3 months. The implication is stark. Most material spending beyond a baseline level produces temporary rather than lasting improvements in well-being, yet the financial cost persists permanently. 8 minimalist principles that build financial permanence. Rule 1. Own your decisions, not your defaults. The first and most foundational rule of minimalist finance is this: every significant recurring expense in your life should be the result of a deliberate, considered choice, not a default you drifted into and have never revisited. Most people's financial lives are dominated by spending defaults. The subscription they signed up for and forgot. The housing they chose at 25 and have never seriously reconsidered. The car payment that felt normal at the time and has quietly shaped their budget ever since. Minimalist finance starts with auditing every single default and asking one question: if I were making this decision fresh today with full awareness of the financial impact, would I make the same choice? That question, asked honestly and applied systematically, tends to reveal that a meaningful portion of most people's spending is not a reflection of what they genuinely value. It's a reflection of decisions made under different circumstances, social defaults inherited without examination, and marketing-driven habits that serve the economy but not the spender. A 2023 survey by C+R Research found that the average American underestimates their monthly subscription spending by over $130 per month, spending an average of $219 on subscriptions monthly, while estimating they spend only $86. The gap is not dishonesty, but genuine unawareness. Subscriptions are specifically designed with friction-reducing auto-renewal and trial-to-paid conversion mechanics that exploit the tendency to accept defaults. The first step in minimalist finance is simply seeing clearly what your defaults are costing you. The practical application here is the annual spending audit we've discussed in previous episodes, but with a specifically minimalist lens. Don't just ask what you're spending, ask what you're spending on things you would actively and enthusiastically choose to keep if you had to decide fresh today. The things that pass that test are your intentional spending. The rest is your default spending. Default spending is where financial freedom goes to disappear quietly. Rule 2. The cost of ownership is always more than the price. One of the most consistent cognitive biases in financial decision-making is what behavioral economists call the focusing illusion, the tendency to overweight a single salient piece of information when making decisions, while underweighting a cluster of less visible but equally important factors. In consumer decisions, the focusing illusion typically shows up as fixating on the purchase price while systematically ignoring the total cost of ownership. Maintenance, insurance, storage, time, opportunity cost, and the cognitive load of managing and maintaining the thing you bought. Minimalist finance insists on total cost accounting before every significant purchase. Not just what does this cost to buy, but what does this cost to own, maintain, insure, store, eventually dispose of, and worry about over its useful lifetime? And what could those same dollars and that same cognitive energy have produced if directed elsewhere? Psychologist Kahneman, Netsch, and Thaler, on what they called the endowment effect and focusing illusion, found that people systematically overestimate how much pleasure a new possession will bring them and underestimate the ongoing costs and complications of ownership. In a widely cited study, Kahneman noted that nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you are thinking about it, a direct reference to the tendency to overweight the anticipated benefit of an acquisition at the moment of decision. The result is chronic over-purchasing, followed by chronic disappointment in the satisfaction delivered. Applied practically, before any purchase above, say, $100, pause and calculate the real cost. A $35,000 car doesn't cost $35,000. It costs $35,000 plus approximately $1,500 per year in insurance, $600 per year in maintenance, $2,000 in annual depreciation in the early years, and the opportunity cost of those invested dollars over the ownership period. A car driven for 5 years at these numbers costs closer to $55,000 to $60,000 in total real terms. Seeing that full number changes decisions. Rule 3. Automate the important things, decide nothing else. Minimalist finance draws heavily on behavioral economics for this rule. The research on decision fatigue, the documented decline in decision quality as the number of decisions made in a given period increases, applies directly to financial choices. Every financial decision that requires active willpower to execute correctly is a decision that will eventually be made incorrectly. The minimalist finance approach is to automate every financial decision that should always be made the same way, and then make as few conscious financial decisions as possible with the remainder. What gets automated? Everything structural. The monthly investment contribution to your retirement account and brokerage, the emergency fund top-up, the debt repayment above minimums, the monthly transfer to a savings goal. These decisions should be made once, thoughtfully, with full intention, and then run on autopilot indefinitely, requiring active effort to cancel rather than active effort to execute. Nobel laureate Richard Thaler and Shlomo Benartzi, in their landmark research on the Save More Tomorrow program, published in the Journal of Political Economy, found that commitment-based automatic savings contributions, where participants pre-committed to directing a portion of future raises to savings before receiving them, resulted in savings rates more than 3 times higher than those achieved through voluntary savings behavior. The structural automation removed the monthly decision point entirely. When good behavior is the default and requires effort to interrupt, the savings rate improves dramatically. When good behavior requires monthly effort and willpower, most people fail most months. The minimalist dimension of this rule is not just about savings, it's about cognitive simplicity. Every financial decision you automate is a decision you no longer have to make. Every recurring expense you eliminate is a decision that no longer exists. The minimalist finance practitioner aims to reduce their financial decision surface area as much as possible, not because they're lazy, but because they understand that fewer, better decisions produce better outcomes than many scattered, willpower-dependent ones. Rule 4. Your housing is your largest lever. Pull it deliberately. If there is one spending category where minimalist finance principles produce the most financially consequential results, it is housing. Housing is typically the largest single expense category in any household budget, representing 30 to 40% of total spending for most Americans. A minimalist approach to housing, specifically resisting the cultural default toward ever larger, ever more expensive housing as income increases, can free up more financial capacity than any other single decision in personal finance. The cultural pressure to upgrade housing with each income increase is pervasive and powerful. It's one of the most visible status signals available. It's tied deeply to the American dream narrative, and the real estate industry, the mortgage industry, and the lifestyle media ecosystem all reinforce the idea that you should always be in the most house you can qualify for. Minimalist finance asks a different question. What is the minimum housing that provides genuine quality of life for your household, and what does the difference in cost between that and the cultural maximum cost produce in financial terms if invested instead? A study by economists at Princeton found that life satisfaction associated with housing plateaued significantly above a certain baseline quality threshold, meaning that the marginal well-being benefit of upgrading from adequate to luxurious housing was substantially smaller than the marginal financial cost. The researchers found that for most households, the psychological benefits of housing are primarily driven by privacy, safety, location, and a sense of home, none of which require the premium square footage and premium amenities that dominate modern housing marketing. The math here is genuinely staggering. The difference between a $2,000 monthly rent and a $2,800 $1,200 monthly rent is $800 per month, $9,600 per year. Invested at 8% annually over 30 years, that $800 monthly difference becomes approximately $1.2 million. The minimalist finance practitioner looks at every housing upgrade not as a lifestyle choice, but as a multi-decade investment decision, and frequently concludes that the adequate option is worth dramatically more than the premium option when the opportunity cost is fully accounted for. Rule 5. Spend on experiences thoughtfully, not reactively. Minimalist finance is not anti-experience. In fact, the research consistently shows that spending on genuine experiences, particularly those that involve other people, novelty, and personal growth, produces significantly better well-being returns than spending on possessions. The minimalist finance rule around experiences is not to minimize them, but to make them deliberate and meaningful rather than reactive and habitual. The dinner with close friends is worth far more than the takeout ordered out of boredom or convenience. The planned annual trip is worth far more than 10 weekend getaways purchased impulsively. Research by psychologist Thomas Gilovich at Cornell University, spanning multiple studies over 2 decades, found that experiential purchases, spending on experiences like travel, concerts, meals, and activities, produced higher levels of lasting satisfaction than material purchases of comparable monetary value. Crucially, Gilovich found that experiential memories became more positive over time due to a tendency to remember the narrative arc of an experience rather than its inconveniences. Material purchases, by contrast, tended to produce declining satisfaction over time as novelty wore off. The implication for minimalist finance: when discretionary spending is chosen, directing it toward experiences over objects typically produces better long-run value per dollar. The practical application is what I'd call the experience budget, a deliberately sized annual allocation for experiences that matter to you: travel, dining, events, hobbies, that is protected from lifestyle inflation, but also from guilt. Spending on high-quality, high-value experiences is entirely consistent with minimalist finance principles. Spending on low-quality, reactive, habitual experiences that you don't particularly remember afterward is not. The difference is intentionality, not the category. Rule 6. The 72-hour rule for all non-essential purchases. One of the most empirically supported behavioral finance interventions for reducing impulsive spending is a mandatory waiting period between the impulse to purchase and the actual purchase. Minimalist finance practitioners implement a 72-hour rule for all non-essential purchases above a personally meaningful threshold, typically somewhere between $30 and $100, depending on income level. The purchase is not forbidden, it is deferred. After 72 hours, if the desire to purchase is still present at full intensity, the purchase may be made. Research consistently shows that a very high percentage of impulse purchase desires diminish or disappear completely within 72 hours without producing any lasting disappointment. Behavioral research on impulse buying by Baumeister, Vos, and colleagues found that purchase impulses are heavily influenced by the immediate emotional state of the buyer, and that emotional states are transient by nature. Studies on purchase return rates found that a significant proportion of returned goods were purchased impulsively in positive emotional states and returned after the emotional state had normalized, suggesting that many purchases are fundamentally emotion-driven rather than need-driven. A mandatory waiting period effectively decouples the purchasing decision from the emotion state that generated it, allowing rational evaluation to occur separately from the impulse. The 72-hour rule is also a powerful tool for distinguishing genuine desire from socially triggered desire, the impulse purchase that isn't really about the thing, but about a social comparison or a moment of status anxiety. After 72 hours, away from the trigger, socially motivated desires tend to dissolve in a way that genuinely need-driven or value-aligned desires don't. If you still want it just as much 3 days later, you probably genuinely want it. If the desire is gone, the purchase would have been a mistake. Rule 7. Measure purchases in hours of life, not dollars. One of the most clarifying mental reframes in all of minimalist finance comes from the classic personal finance book, Your Money or Your Life, by Vicki Robin and Joe Dominguez. The central concept is to measure all spending not in dollars, but in life energy, specifically in the number of hours of work required to earn the after-tax dollars needed for a purchase. This mental reframe fundamentally changes the emotional valence of spending decisions, transforming them from abstract dollar to dopamine transactions into concrete lifetime to object transactions. Let's make this concrete. If your take-home hourly rate is $25 per hour, roughly $50,000 annual salary after taxes, a $500 purchase costs 20 hours of your life. A $1,200 couch costs 48 hours. A $45,000 car costs 1,800 hours, roughly 11 months of working every single day. When you translate purchases into hours of life energy rather than dollars, the calculus changes significantly. Most people will work much harder to preserve an hour of their time than to preserve a dollar, even though those two things are mathematically equivalent. The life energy frame makes this equivalence viscerally felt rather than merely intellectually understood. Research on subjective well-being by Cassie Mogelner and colleagues at UCLA found that thinking about time rather than money when making spending decisions was associated with significantly higher post-purchase satisfaction and a greater tendency to make spending choices aligned with personal values rather than social comparison. People primed to think about time before making consumer decisions reported spending more on genuine personal priorities and less on status signaling consumption. The time frame appears to activate a different, more authentic value system than the money frame. The minimalist finance practitioner builds this mental reframe into their decision-making as a default. Before any significant discretionary purchase, they ask, how many hours of my life does this cost? Is what I'm getting worth that many hours of the only irreplaceable resource I have? For many purchases, the answer remains yes, and those purchases should be made without guilt. For many others, this question produces a very different answer than the dollar price alone would have suggested. Rule 8. Design your environment for financial simplicity. The final minimalist finance rule is perhaps the most sophisticated and the least frequently discussed. The physical and digital environment you inhabit shapes your spending behavior far more powerfully than your financial intentions. This is not a metaphor. It is a documented behavioral phenomenon. People who live in environments optimized for consumption, who are surrounded by advertisements, shopping apps, social media feeds full of aspirational purchases, Amazon Prime with one-click buying, spend more money and save less than those who have deliberately designed their environment to reduce consumption triggers. Minimalist finance includes the deliberate management of your consumption environment as a core financial practice. Research by Brian Wansink and colleagues on environmental influences on eating behavior, later extended by Thaler, Sunstein, and other behavioral economists to financial contexts, found that environmental design consistently outperforms intention and willpower in shaping behavior. In financial contexts, deleting shopping apps reduces impulse purchases. Removing saved credit card information from browsers reduces online spending. Unsubscribing from promotional emails reduces trigger-driven shopping. Moving to neighborhoods with different consumption norms reduces social spending pressure. The physical and digital environment is a behavioral system that operates below the level of conscious decision-making, and designing it intentionally is one of the highest leverage financial actions available. Practically, this means the minimalist finance practitioner treats their environment as a variable to be optimized, not a given to be endured. They delete apps that create consumption triggers. They unsubscribe from marketing emails that create artificial urgency. They remove one-click buying capabilities that reduce friction between impulse and purchase. They curate their social media to reduce comparison-driven spending impulses. And they fill the environment with signal signals and structures that make good financial behavior easy and poor financial behavior effortful. The happiness science, why less often means more. I want to spend some time on the happiness dimension of minimalist finance because one of the most common objections to this philosophy is the assumption that spending less means enjoying life less. The research on this assumption is remarkably consistent, and it largely contradicts the intuition. The relationship between spending and happiness is not linear, and it is not even reliably positive beyond a certain threshold. The classic finding by economists Angus Dayton and the late Daniel Kahneman, both Nobel laureates, established that emotional well-being rises with income up to a certain threshold, but plateaus significantly above it. More recently, a 2021 study by Matthew Killingsworth, using real-time experience sampling on a large sample, suggested the relationship may extend further up the income scale than originally thought. But the critical insight from both bodies of work is the same. The incremental happiness benefit of spending above a baseline level is dramatically smaller than most people assume, and the sacrifices made to achieve high spending levels, longer working hours, higher financial stress, reduced time, carry real well-being costs that are frequently underestimated. A landmark study by Dunn, Gilbert, and Wilson, published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology, identified 8 key principles of how money best buys happiness. Their findings included buying experiences rather than things, buying for others as well as for oneself, buying many small pleasures rather than few large ones, avoiding insurance and extended warranties, paying now and consuming later, avoiding adaptation by varying consumption, focusing on the happiness of others, and avoiding the tendency to make purchases in pursuit of social comparison. Every single one of these principles is also a minimalist finance principle, suggesting that the financial strategy most likely to build wealth is also the financial strategy most likely to maximize happiness from spending. The minimalist finance practitioner, in other words, isn't making a sacrifice. They are making an upgrade. They are trading habitual, comparison-driven, default spending for intentional, value-aligned, experience-rich spending, while redirecting the financial difference toward long-term security that itself produces well-being through the reduction of financial anxiety and the expansion of future options. Research by Ruberton, Gladstone, and Lubomirsky, published in the journal In Motion, found that having liquid savings, money in accessible accounts, was positively associated with daily well-being independently of income level. The researchers found that the relationship between savings and happiness was mediated by reduced financial anxiety, and that this anxiety reduction effect was present even at relatively modest savings levels. The implication? Building savings through minimalist spending practices directly improves daily well-being through a reduction in the low-grade financial stress that affects people who are living at or near the edge of their income. The financial math. What minimalism produces over time. Let me make the long-run financial case for these 8 rules as concretely as possible, because the cumulative impact of minimalist finance practices over a career is not marginal, it is transformative. Consider 2 hypothetical people with identical incomes, let's say $75,000 per year, who make different financial choices. Person A follows a conventional consumption pattern, housing at 35% of income, a car payment, modest retirement contributions around 6% to capture the employer match, and gradually expanding lifestyle spending as income grows over their career. Person B follows minimalist finance principles, housing at 25% of income, a used reliable car purchased without financing, retirement contributions at 20% of income from the start, and a deliberate policy of directing 50% of all income increases to savings rather than lifestyle. The income is identical. The difference is entirely behavioral. After 30 years, with the same market returns available to both, Person B's portfolio is not just somewhat larger than Person A's, it is dramatically, categorically larger. The compounding effect of a 20% savings rate versus a 6% savings rate over 3 decades on identical incomes produces a difference in retirement assets that runs into the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, depending on the time horizon and market conditions. Research by financial economist William Bernstein demonstrated that for investors in the wealth accumulation phase, the savings rate is approximately 10 times more impactful on the final portfolio value than the investment return. A person saving 20% of income with average market returns will outperform a person saving 6% of income with above-average returns in most scenarios over long accumulation periods. The savings rate, the variable most directly controlled by minimalist finance principles, is the dominant driver of long-run financial outcomes for most households. The minimalist finance rules in this episode are not a philosophy for people who don't care about money. They're a philosophy for people who care about money deeply, specifically about having it in lasting, meaningful amounts that provide genuine security and genuine freedom. And the research consistently shows that the path to that outcome runs not through maximizing consumption, but through simplifying it. Let me close with this. In a consumer economy, the most radical financial act you can perform is to decide for yourself what is enough. Not enough in a resigned, self-denying sense, but enough in the sense of genuinely, consciously knowing what your life needs to be good, and refusing to spend a dollar beyond that on things that don't contribute to that goodness. The 8 rules we've covered today are not about deprivation. They're not about minimizing your enjoyment of life. They're about a kind of financial clarity, seeing your money for what it actually is, which is a finite resource that can be converted into either temporary consumption or lasting freedom, but rarely both. The minimalist finance practitioner doesn't live with less because they have no choice. They live with less because they've done the math, read the research on happiness, sat with the question of what they actually value, and concluded that a specific, well-chosen set of expenditures and experiences produces a better life than an unfocused, default, consumption-driven one, and that the difference in savings goes towards something that compounds in value in a way that another pair of shoes or a larger car simply cannot. You always have money when you always know where it goes. And you always know where it goes when you've decided deliberately and with full information what your money is for. Thanks for watching. Tell me in the comments, which of these 8 rules is the one you most need to implement, and which is the one you already practice? I read all of them. Share this with someone who's looking for a less stressful relationship with money. Like and subscribe for the next one. See you there.